Greetings and welcome to Train Signal. You're watching Install, Configure, and Manage the Mailbox Role. It's a primary section of the 70-341 exam, the Exchange 2003 Core exam. And in this lesson, we'll be discussing the subsection Configure and Manage the Mailbox Role. Under the subsection Configure and Manage the Mailbox Role, this objective may include, but is not limited to, create and configure offline address books, create and configure public folders, deploy mailbox server roles, and design and create hierarchical address lists. 4 completely separate and unique subjects. Okay, so let's get started. To put our mind in the game, the scenario that we're going to be looking into is a company called Physicians Quorum. So our company, Exchange, is going to be helping them. Their company, shortened to FIQO, is a grouping of physicians within the United States dedicated to improving healthcare. Now, their problem is they have distributed offices with location and organizational hierarchy mismatches. Our goal is to utilize a location-appropriate public folder structure with a hierarchical address book configuration. Now, what that means is we need to establish public folders and put them in locations that make sense. At the same time, we want to ensure an address book configuration that focuses more on the organizational structure and less on things like location. So, starting with offline address books. Offline address books are used by Outlook clients in cached exchange mode for address book lookups while offline. The concept is pretty simple. If you're offline, you're not able to access the Exchange server in order to locate addresses that you typically might locate using the address book. So by having this offline address book, it really helps you in terms of being able to find those addresses. However, in some companies, the global address list is huge, and so you might configure offline address books that are specific to the individual, and so perhaps narrow down the individual's needs so that that offline address book is something that's more manageable. Now, what's interesting about cached exchange mode is that this is not something that's new. This is something that's been around for a while. And what it does is it allows for this offline view of your mail, because what happens is you have a copy of your mailbox stored on your computer. And so that copy provides quick access to your email data. And so when you connect in with your mail server, the offline copy is updated. That's nice, so that even if you're offline, you have access to your email, or at least the email that has downloaded from the Exchange server because you've synced up with it. Now, one of the things that's valuable about the offline address book is that it takes the load off of Exchange, because Exchange will actually query the offline address book first before going back and checking the Exchange server for any addresses that perhaps it doesn't already have. So those offline address books are not just useful for working offline, but they also take that load off the Exchange server. Now, in previous Exchange releases, the offline address book generation, it was actually bound to specific Exchange servers by the server property. So basically, the default behavior was when you install the first Exchange mailbox server, setup will designate it as the offline address book generation server. Well, that's changed. With Exchange 2013, it alters the offline address book generation process. So ultimately, the offline address book is generated by each 2013 mailbox server that hosts a special arbitration mailbox, which actually provides for greater resiliency. The arbitration mailbox is called the organization mailbox. And so the offline address book is generated in the organization mailbox first, and then it's later copied to the disk. At the end of this lesson, under additional research, there's an article entitled OAB in Exchange Server 2013. It's an article on the Exchange Team blog site. I definitely recommend that you take the time to read that article and to get a better understanding of how offline address books work in Exchange 2013. especially with regard to this new arrangement where there's greater resiliency as a result of their being generated by mailbox servers with that special arbitration mailbox. Let's take a moment and jump over to our Exchange environment and take a look at how we would work with offline address books. Alright, so here we are on the Windows Server 2012. It's the Exchange server. We're actually on the Client Access server because that's where we can easily access our Exchange Admin Center. And so we're talking about the offline address book, but really that connects to a lot of other things. For example, that connects to the address list that we have, because you can create offline address books, additional ones, as opposed to just the default. And with those additional offline address books, you can establish different address lists. Remember, that helps to mitigate the size of the OAB. And so in larger organizations, you might want to create different offline address books for different parts of your organization. Now, how might you apply those offline address books? Well, there's a couple of different ways. For one, you might assign them through the database itself. So you can actually choose the offline address book on the database level. And if we just open up one of our databases and we look at the client settings, here you can see offline address book. We click Browse. Currently, we only have the default offline address book, and so we can choose this for the database, say OK, and there it is. Now, being that there's only one, that's not really much of a challenge. How do we create additional ones? Well, we're actually looking at PowerShell for that. We would use the new -offline address book to create a new address book. But as far as creating address lists that we can use to go inside the address book, that actually can be done through the organization features under address lists. We can actually create an address list in here. But before we get too far ahead here, it's good to remember the way that the offline address book is generated. So essentially, there's a service, the Offline Address Book Generation Service, or OAB-Gen, and it runs on the mailbox server that hosts the organizational mailbox. So what it does is it actually identifies the recipients that should be part of that offline address book. It creates the OAB, and it puts that file in the Exchange server files under Client Access OAB. But you might be wondering, well, how do I know in my environment which server is the one that's actually the OAB generation server? Well, in smaller environments, that's easy to figure out. It's typically the first mailbox server that you installed. In our case, we know that we installed MB1 before MB2, and so most likely our organizational mailbox is actually located on MB1. But let's make sure. But let's prove that. If we go to the Exchange Management Shell, you can see we already have a command typed in there. No point in having you watch me type. And you can see that the command is get-mailbox-arbitration pipeline, where, and then you can see a lot of different characters there, the brackets, the $, underscore, period, persisted capabilities, -like, and then in quotes with stars on both end is OAB. Yes, I know. This is one of the reasons why folks don't necessarily like PowerShell sometimes, because it does have a little bit of craziness there in terms of what you have to type in. But that's okay. This is not the kind of thing that you need to remember or memorize. This is the kind of thing that you research. So if you start thinking, hey, I need to figure out the organization mailbox and where it's located, you would just do a search for that, and you'd come back with this commandlet and type it in. So we hit enter. And as expected, it returns the MB1 as the server that's hosting the organization mailbox and the arbitration mailbox. All right, so now let's create an address list, and then we'll create a new offline address book that uses that address list, and then we'll apply it to the database itself. So we click the plus sign here under address lists. Let's say this is for a temp department in our organization, so we'll call it temp department. We can adjust the path, but for now we'll leave it at the root. All recipient types, we can add a rule here. And let's say we want the rule to focus in on department, the department being temp department. We hit the plus sign, and we say OK. All right, so all recipients that are in the temp department will also be included in this new address list called Temp Department. We click Save. It gives us a warning that we have to click Update in the Details pane. We say OK. We'll refresh, and there we go. We have this Temp Department address list. But now at this point, if we want to create a new offline address book, we have to go back to PowerShell. So from here, if we type in new-offline address book, we'll give it a name. How about Temp Department? That makes it easier. And the address lists, Temp Department. All right, so that completed just fine. Now, one of the things we could do at this point is we could use PowerShell to create a new address book policy. We would use the new-address book policy commandlet to do that. In that case, that commandlet is actually pretty large because it involves putting in a name, indicating the address list, the offline address book, the global address list. Then you could set the mailbox that's going to actually have the policy applied, or the mailboxes. And so that can become quite involved. But that is a valid way to apply this new offline address book through an address book policy. In our case, we're just going to utilize that new offline address book by going to our servers again. And we're not actually going to apply it. We're just going to take a look to see that it exists. We click Browse. And now you can see that that Temp Department offline address book was created, and we can apply it now at the database level. Or, like I said, we could create an address book policy and apply it through the policy. And that gives us more flexibility because applying it at the database level doesn't give us a lot of flexibility. However, creating an address book policy and applying that to mailboxes, that's a lot more flexible. All right, let's jump back over to our server and let's talk now about public folders. The next part of our discussion for this lesson is public folder configuration. Now, we all understand at this point that public folders are no longer given their own public folder database. They're now created within a public folder mailbox, which is inside a mailbox database. There's pros and cons to this. It doesn't really matter if we like it or not. It's just a new way of doing things. Ultimately, we have the ability now to put that mailbox database in a DAG, and correspondingly the public folder mailbox and public folders are then made more highly available. The negative side is that we're no longer able to make a replica of data and put it closer to individuals who might need to access that public folder information on a more regular basis. So because it's a public folder mailbox, the public folders simply reside wherever we create those folders. Now, we say that, and yet at the same time, you can place public folders on different servers and different mailbox databases. But the end user will see the hierarchy without knowing the locations. So here you can see we have a public folder named London, and it's located on a server in London, a mailbox server. There's a subfolder, HR, in London, located on the London mailbox server. There's a marketing folder that is actually located on a New York mailbox server. So when the end user is looking and sees the structure looks as if that marketing folder is also in London. But it's not. It's actually located in New York. Now that might be confusing to end users and perhaps to some administrators as well. But in reality, the end user never really knows where those folders are. As for administrators, well, it's essential that we keep good records as to where we're putting things. But even if we don't have good records, when we look at the public folder structure, we can quickly and easily see what database and server those public folders are located on. Let's jump over to our Exchange environment and let's take a look at how we would create these different public folders on our different mailbox servers. Alright, so here we are on our Exchange server, and if we just go over to the Exchange Admin Center, we can see here under the Public Folders feature, we have two public folder mailboxes that have already been created. And so Again, for the basics of public folders and creating public folder mailboxes and going through the wizards and so forth, I recommend that you take a look at the Exchange 2013 administration course for really the administration side to Exchange 2013. We're focused here on the 70-341 certification exam, and so we're not starting at the beginning in terms of how we create all of this. We're starting from the point of being administrators and moving forward to learn the nitty-gritty details of Exchange for the sake of the certification exam. So here we're looking at public folders. This one is Orlando, this one is New York, and we can actually look inside and see where these things are located. You can see that this one is on Mailbox Database MB1, and this one is Mailbox Database MB2. Now, we know where those are because if we just go to servers, we can see under databases that we have two different mailbox servers, MB1 and MB2, and the databases correspond to those. So we're looking at two different public folder mailboxes. And so that sounds great because, as we discussed with public folders, we can separate and split up where the public folders reside. And not just at the root level. For example, if we go to public folders, here we see we have a sales subfolder. It's at the root, and it's in the mailbox. Here we see we have a sales subfolder in the Orlando mailbox. Well, we can not only decide to have folders and subfolders at the root, but we can actually nest additional public folders within the sales subfolder. And these child folders can be located in some cases in Orlando. In some cases, we might put them in New York. The question really is, how do we accomplish this? So you might be thinking, well, what do you mean? If we create a subfolder, don't we get to choose where to put it? Actually, no. If you click the plus sign here, let's say we want to create a marketing public folder right there at the root. We click Save. Notice it didn't ask us where we want to put it. So now we're kind of stuck. Now we have marketing in Orlando, but let's say the marketing department is in New York. Well, what do? There's no way to edit this and change it. We can change permissions. There's really not much we can do. We can select it and click Edit. It doesn't give us a chance to change any of the information. We can look at statistics. We can establish limits in terms of quotas. We can establish deleted item retention, age limits. So that's great. This is all part of the public folder structure. But again, we have no way of changing this over to New York. Well, I think you probably know where I'm going with this. We're going to need to use PowerShell. So here, if we go down to the Exchange Management Shell that's already open, you can see that we're using the set-public folder commandlet, and we're just letting it know that we're going to take the marketing subfolder that's at the root, and we're going to move it over to New York. We hit Enter. It wants to confirm that this is what we really want to do. We'll hit A for yes to all, and we're all set. Let's clear the screen. If we go back here to public folders and we refresh, notice now marketing is in New York. Now, certainly the easier thing to do is to be able to create this in the proper location to start with. So how would we accomplish that? Obviously not through the GUI. So if we look under the new -public folder commandlet instructions from TechNet, you can see that it provides us with a variety of different examples. New public folder with the name and the path, but notice new public folder with the name and then the mailbox that we're looking for. So let's try this one. If we go back to the Exchange Management Shell and we type new public folder, and let's say the name in this case is HR, and let's say HR is also located in New York. All right, we hit Enter. Everything looks good. We go back to our public folders, refresh, and there we see our HR subfolder in New York. And the same is true of folders that are nested within. For example, if we had a folder in sales that was, let's say, Division 1, Division 2, Division 3, we can have additional subfolders, and we can either create them using the new -public folder commandlet, right in the mailbox that we choose. Or if we create it at the root using the GUI, we can always go back and we can use the set-public folder to move that nested public folder over to the mailbox of our choosing. So this is just good to keep in mind that we can actually distribute out where we want those public folders to reside in terms of the mailbox itself and then the mailbox database. So there's a lot of control that's been given to us here when it comes to public folders. I know it's different from what we had in previous versions of Exchange. Nevertheless, through PowerShell, we do have quite a bit of control and flexibility. Now, one thing that comes up from time to time is how you would move public folder mailboxes as well as public folders. So once created, you can move public folder mailboxes and public folders, whether individual public folders or multiple ones. To move a public folder mailbox, you use the new-move request commandlet. To move a single public folder or even multiple public folders, you use the new-public folder move request. And then to move an entire branch of public folders, you use the script move-public folder branch.ps1. Obviously, there are parameters that you can utilize with these commandlets. If you're doing this in a production environment, you want to make sure that you've researched them properly to ensure that you're using the commandlets in the appropriate way with the proper parameters. But now what if you're not starting from a greenfield deployment of Exchange? In other words, what if this isn't a brand new Exchange environment, but you're actually migrating or transitioning over from another flavor of Exchange, a legacy version of Exchange? And perhaps you have a public folder infrastructure already in place. Let's talk about how you would migrate public folders to Exchange 2013. As far as migrating public folders to Exchange 2013, it is super easy to make this happen. Just kidding. It's crazy PowerShell oriented, and it's a multi-step process to make this happen. I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but that's just the case. You'll use the public folder migration request commandlets to make it happen, and you can also use some PowerShell scripts to help you. TechNet maps the whole thing out for you. Here's the link, and you will definitely want to utilize the direction provided if you're doing this type of public folder migration in a production environment. Switching gears a bit, the lesson is following the objectives for the 70-341 exam, and so deploying Exchange server roles is part of the objectives for this lesson. So what advice really is the best advice I can give you when it comes to real-world deployment? Well, the best advice I can give you is that you always, even if you're doing a small single server installation, you should always use the Microsoft Exchange Server Deployment Assistant. Here's the link for it here, and ultimately it's a very simple website where you can actually choose if you're going to be moving from Exchange 2003 or 2007 over to Exchange Server 2010, or perhaps doing a greenfield deployment or brand new installation of Exchange in your environment with Exchange Server 2010. And that's on the left side. Over on the right side, you can see Exchange Server 2013 Deployment Assistant. This will assist as well with on-premise deployment, hybrid deployments, and cloud-only deployments. It will also assist with transitioning from Exchange 2007 or 2010 over to Exchange 2013. There is no transition path for Exchange 2003 over to 2013. In that case, you would have to do a double hop, which is where you would use this deployment assistant to hop from 2003 to 2010 and then over to 2013. Let's take a quick look at this deployment assistant because it's really impressive how it works. You choose your path, you choose the type of deployment, you answer a few questions, and it really just spits out the results. Now we're talking about deploying server roles. Perhaps this discussion could also branch off into a discussion of design and how you would lay out those server roles. So that's something we'll save for another time. The design side to deploying server roles really comes down to the number of locations you have, the network infrastructure and support of each location, where it's best to put additional Exchange servers, mailbox servers, Perhaps you want to keep them all centralized. Perhaps you want to deploy them in alternate locations. Maybe part of the reason for doing that is because you want to have a secondary high availability location, perhaps a primary data center and a secondary data center type setup. So there's a lot to consider when it comes to designing the deployment of Exchange Server roles. The Deployment Assistant is more about the nitty-gritty configuration options, everything from installing the server role to configuring the client access and mailbox server roles to work properly within the Exchange environment. Alright, so let's jump over to the Exchange Server Deployment Assistant and take a look at some of the options available. Alright folks, so here it is, the Microsoft Exchange Server Deployment Assistant. This is a great tool for helping us to not forget any little piece of the deployment when deploying an Exchange environment. So whether it's a single server or multiple servers, whether you're migrating from a legacy version or doing a greenfield installation, the Deployment Assistant is really the perfect tool for you. Now, for starters, we can look at the Exchange side first, but let's just look at the 2010 side because the Exchange side is actually just getting started. You know, TrainSignal wanted to get this information into your hands as quickly as possible, and so we're creating content as the Exchange team is also creating the tools that are needed for deploying Exchange. So they're a little bit behind the actual deployment of Exchange 2013 into the wild. You'll see that in a moment. If we look at the 2010 Deployment Assistant, this is going to be very helpful to you if you are doing a deployment from 2003 to 2013, because you'll have to do what's called a double hop transition or migration. And so essentially you cannot go from 2003 to 2013, so you'll have to go to 2010 first. Alright, so we look, and here you can see three different options. If we click on premises only, you can see the various options that we can choose from. Let's say if we're upgrading from 2003 to 2010, we answer a few questions, whether or not we're going to move all users to Exchange 2010 at once. Are we using an Edge Transport server, a unified messaging server? So here we could say yes or no to these different options. We click the arrow moving forward, and here it gives us a checklist of all of the things that we need to keep in mind and what we need to do. In fact, if we select any one of these, you can see it actually gives us the step-by-steps on how to perform the task, screenshots and all. Really, this is a great tool. It really is. So, okay, we've had a chance to see the 2010 side. Let's jump over to the 2013 side. Alright, so Exchange Server 2013 Deployment Assistant. And as you can see, it's got a little bit of a different graphic look. It has that Metro look to it. So we have on-premises, and currently you can only find installation instructions for a greenfield deployment, a new installation of Exchange 2013. But over time, these others will be available as we're able to do the 2007 and 2010 transitions. Alright, so if we select that and we click Next, it asks us some important questions. Are we going to install the CAS and the mailbox server on the same server or different servers? Depending on our answers, it will give us different instructions. It asks us if we're running a disjointed namespace. Are we going with unified messaging? Keep in mind, unified messaging services will be installed either way, but depending on how we answer this, that will determine what response we get back. And as you can see, it gives us the checklist, and it tells us how to use and navigate the checklist. So this is really a great tool. It's the perfect tool for any deployment of Exchange because it makes sure you don't forget the little nitty-gritty things that sometimes you just might miss as you're doing an installation. I know personally I've done hundreds of installations of Exchange, and I still use the checklist just to make sure I don't forget something along the way. Alright, let's jump back over to our slides and let's talk a little bit more about hierarchical lists. Alright, so we've talked about offline address books earlier on in the lesson, and at that time you had a chance to see the various address lists, which are under the organizational feature in the Exchange Admin Center. We created a new offline address book, we applied an address list, we talked a little bit about address book policies, But there's another new feature that's worth mentioning and talking about here with Exchange 2013. It's called Hierarchical Address Book. And the HAB Hierarchical Address Book feature, this is a way to allow end users to look for recipients within their address book based on their organizational hierarchy, as opposed to the global address list structure. So it's just a different view for your company. Instead of it being based upon, let's say, location, where you might have a list for Chicago, a list for New York, a list for Florida, and you have to find people based upon their location, you can find them based upon the organizational chart or hierarchy. Now, obviously, this is not something that just magically appears. It takes a little bit of work to create and configure the hierarchical address book. You have to use the Exchange Management Shell to create the HAB structure. But once you do that, you can use the Exchange Admin Center to manage memberships. So to create the root for the HAB, you use the set-organizational config -hierarchical address book root and then put in the name of the root. And then to add subordinate groups, you use the set-group commandlet and the add-distribution group member. So you configure distribution groups, and from there you can actually set them in the HAB structure. It's important that you map this out and plan it properly first before you actually deploy the HAB structure. There's a TechNet article that maps out how to create and configure these hierarchical address books. Let's take a look at that article real quick so that you have an understanding as to the process that's involved in creating this structure. Alright, so here's an article through TechNet entitled Enable or Disable Hierarchical Address Books, and you'll find this link as well at the end of the lesson. It is listed with the additional resource links. Now, it's good to keep in mind that this does take some time when you do sit down and want to do this. Notice it says estimated time to complete 1 hour. And so let me just show you what's involved with creating this hierarchical address book structure. If we just scroll down, here you can see use the shell to enable a HAB. And you can see that there's quite a bit of PowerShell involved. You'll be creating distribution groups. You'll be using that set-organization config commandlet. And you can see that it goes for quite a while until you reach the point where your end users can actually click Address Book through Outlook and see something like this. So in all honesty, it's a great feature, but being that it's not baked right in and it's something that requires so much configuration, you may want to just take your time with this and work it through in a lab environment first before deploying it to your production environment. Alright, so let's make this hierarchical address book actually happen. So for starters, you might want to create an additional organizational unit for your HAB. And so in the instructions in the TechNet article on enabling hierarchical address books, they recommend that you use the dsadd command in order to create this new OU, or you can jump over to your domain controllers and you can use Active Directory users and computers and create this new organizational unit called HAB. And so we've already done that. We have the OU. The next part of the process is to create the root distribution group, which in our case is going to be called FIQO, and that is for the HAB. Now, you can use the Exchange Management Shell, or you can use the Exchange Admin Center to create distribution groups. In this case, we're just going to use the shell because we're here. We could just jump over and do it from the EAC, but let's use the shell to start with. So we type new distribution group. We'll give it the name FIQO. Display name FIQO. Alias, well, once again, alias, in this case, FIQO root. And we're putting it in the organizational unit, exchange.com/HAB. We have to give it a SAM account name, FIQO root, and the type is distribution. All right, if everything is all set there, hopefully we typed everything properly, we hit enter. All right, that's a good sign. So if we jump back over to our EAC and we refresh groups, you can see there's that FIQO distribution group. Again, we could have created it here, but sometimes it's good to demonstrate the PowerShell side to things. So we go back. The next part of the process is to designate FIQO as the root organization for the HAB. So we type set organization config, and you'll recall this was part of the slides, the set-organization config commandlet. It's the hierarchical address book root, and we're calling it FIQO. And we hit enter. All right, so at this point we have the distribution group root, but what we want to do next is create distribution groups for the other tiers in the HAB. Now, granted, depending on your organization, those tiers will be different, so you can't assume that whatever I'm typing here that you're going to be using the same ones for your organization. But you might have a sales, you might have a marketing, you might have an HR. Those are different roots that you might have. So just like we created the distribution group earlier, here you can see we have that new distribution group. We really just need to change the names. So let's create a marketing group. It goes in the same organizational unit. All right, I think we're all set. We hit enter. And let's just create a sales one as well. All right, and we hit enter. Perfect. Let's just go back to the EAC, refresh. And okay, we can see we have different distribution groups, but how does this help us? Well, patience. We need to now take these distribution groups and designate them as members of the HAB. All right, so now we're going to add the marketing and sales distribution groups into the FIQO distribution group. We'll make it a member. So to do that, we're going to use the add-distribution group member commandlet. And the identity is FIQO, and the member is marketing. And now we'll do the same thing for sales. So that now both marketing and sales are nested within the FIQO distribution group. And we can actually take a look at that here. If we open up the FIQO distribution group and we look at membership, here we can see marketing and sales are nested as members within the FIQO distribution group. All right, and so at this point we can actually have additional distribution groups. We can nest those distribution groups into other ones, and we can really build out the organizational structure. Another thing that we can do is we can actually establish what's called a seniority index parameter for groups in the HAB. And so in doing that, it actually determines how things will be listed out or sorted. That seniority index parameter is a basic number that makes it so that you can put the higher level seniority persons or groups at the top. So if you had an individual that's, let's say, the vice president in the organizational structure, you can give them a seniority index of 100, and they would be at the top of the list when looking at their name in the distribution group through the hierarchical address book, as opposed to being, let's say, alphabetical or at the bottom of the list. And so if you have different levels, you might give the top level staff or vice presidents and partners the seniority index of 100. You might give associate partners the seniority index of 50, and then perhaps with assistants and others, you would give them a seniority index of 25. Now, you might be thinking, wow, that's an awful lot of micromanagement here. I have other things to do. I don't have time to be fiddling around with seniority indexes. Well, and that's fine. That's just an option that you have for the sake of putting the senior positions up at the top. You don't necessarily have to go through and label everyone with a seniority index. All right, so we've created this now, and it's not incredibly elaborate at this point. We have a FIQuo root. We have a FIQuo root with marketing and sales underneath. Now, let's say we have a recipient that's in the sales distribution group, or should be in the sales distribution group. How do we make sure that he's actually in that group? Well, if we go to membership, we click the plus sign. Here we can see, let's say Alan Wright should be a member of that group. We say OK. And now Alan Wright is a member. We click Save. Let's jump over to a client system and let's take a look at their address book. All right, so here we are on a Windows 8 system and we're logged in as the administrator. That's just for testing purposes. If we go to our desktop, we already have Outlook 2013 up and running. And all we want to do here is just see how the work that we've just done has changed our address book. So if we just jump up, click Address Book, you might say, hey, wait a minute, nothing's changed. Here's our global address list, there's our people, and everything looks the same, except we have that temp department address list that we created earlier on in the lesson. But wait a minute. There's a new tab, Organization. And there we can see FIQuo, we see marketing, we see sales. Within sales, we see Alan Wright. We're good to go. So this is a nice feature. It does take some planning, but it's great for situations where you have a distributed environment and perhaps location is not the best way to establish your address lists. And so instead, you'd like to set it up according to organization. And so you can have both. You can have your name lists over here, and you can have your organizational structure over here. All right, so now let's jump back over to our slides, and let's finish up our discussion of the scenario with FIQuo, and we'll also review the list of additional research links. All right, so for our company FIQuo, these folks certainly required a lot of configuration tweaks rather than out-of-the-box exchange. And so what do we mean by that? Well, as we discussed in this lesson, based upon their needs, we had to establish a new offline address book configuration for them. We had to work through modern public folders, and we designed for them the ability to place them in multiple locations. So things like that take time, and it's certainly not out-of-the-box exchange. We had to use the Exchange Management Shell to configure some of these things. They wanted a hierarchical address book, and so we had to configure that. So all of this additional configuration is something that you may have to do for your clients. And it's something that may come into play on the 70-341 exam. And so hopefully you notice that PowerShell came into play quite often within these configurations. So it's essential to know that PowerShell is involved and know when you need to reach out for the Exchange Management Shell in order to accomplish some of these tasks. You know, the EAC is great for most tasks, but not for the nitty-gritty stuff that you may be called upon to perform in a real-world or exam world setting. So hopefully you're taking notes. Now, in addition to the discussion here, there are some additional research points that you want to keep in mind. So the first one is OAB and Exchange Server 2013. Then we have public folders in the new Office. I also put up the link to the Microsoft Deployment Assistant. Don't leave home without it. And we have the Enable or Disable Hierarchical Address Books. That's a good one. So we hope you found this lesson informative. I'd like to thank you for viewing, and I'll see you in the next lesson.